They tell you from the moment you present as Omega that your life is a gift. What they mean is, your life belongs to them. In the collective, designation isn't biology. It isn't fate. It's a filing system. Alphas lead, enforce, and protect state infrastructure. Betas administrate, build, and maintain. Omegas are registered, assigned, and utilized, slotted into roles that serve the machine with minimum friction and maximum compliance. We are given housing vouchers, caloric ration cards, and suppression implants, so our biology never inconveniences anyone around us. We are told we are valued. We are told a lot of things. My name, my real name, is Solon. But inside the Central Registry building on the corner of Civic Meridian and 4th Parallel, I am designation Omega, 7-2241, Senior Filing Clerk, 3rd floor, East Wing. I have held that position for 3 years, for months, and 11 days. I arrive at 0700. I leave at 1800. I eat my rations at my desk. I speak when spoken to and never make eye contact with the alpha supervisors who patrol the floor like the building might try to escape if they stop watching it. I am invisible. That was always the plan. The resistance doesn't recruit loudly. They don't leave pamphlets or spray paint slogans on collective walls the way the old archive footage shows rebels used to do. They are surgical, patient. They find people already inside, people with access, people with something to lose and something to prove, and they give them a very simple instruction. Watch, remember, report. I had been watching for 3 years. The things that move through the Central Registry are not dramatic. There are no single documents labeled top secret, destroy after reading. It's subtler than that. It's a supply order rerouted from District 7 to a facility that doesn't officially exist. It's a personnel file flagged for deletion on the same week a resistance cell in the outer sectors goes dark. It's a medical requisition for suppression compounds in quantities that have no civilian explanation. You have to know what you're looking at. You have to be patient enough to let the picture form one piece at a time. I was very patient. Every 10 days I would leave work, take the long route home through Sector 12, stop at the same gray vendor stall that sold protein blocks and synthetic coffee, and buy nothing. The vendor, a beta man named Oris with tired eyes and quick hands, would slip a data chip into my ration bag during the transaction. I would go home, load the chip, encode my compiled notes, return it the next morning the same way. I never knew where the information went after that. I never asked. I knew better than to want to know more than I needed. For 3 years, for months, and 11 days, the system worked. The night it stopped working, I almost didn't notice. It was a Tuesday. Sector-wide curfew extension had been announced that morning, second one in a month, and the registry floor was quieter than usual. Half the staff dismissed early. The alpha supervisors pulled into an emergency briefing on the upper floors. I stayed late. I always stayed late when the floor emptied. More time at the terminals. Less chance of eyes on my screen. I was pulling a flagged logistics manifest from the archive queue when I heard the elevator. Not unusual. Supervisors used the elevators. Maintenance staff used the elevators. I didn't look up. Then the footsteps stopped. Right behind me. I remember the exact moment my body understood before my mind did. That particular animal stillness that an Omega's biology produces when it registers proximity to a predator. My suppression implant was current. It should have kept my scent flat, unreadable. It should have kept me chemically invisible the same way my file kept me professionally invisible. Should have. Omega, 7-2241. His voice was low, not loud, not aggressive. The kind of controlled quiet that doesn't need volume because it has never once had to raise itself to be obeyed. I closed the manifest. Slowly, I turned around. Enforcer Kael Draven was not what I expected, and I had been expecting him for weeks. Ever since the whisper moved through resistance channels that the collective had deployed their finisher. Their cleanup asset. The one they sent when internal security had already failed and they needed someone who would not fail. The Ghost Breaker. He was tall in the way that enforcer conditioning produces, not exaggerated, not decorative, built entirely for function. Dark tactical uniform without rank insignia, which meant he reported to no one on this floor, possibly no one in this building. His face was angled and still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm, it's calculation. He was looking at me the way I had spent 3 years looking at documents. Like he was reading something. Like he had already found it. In his right hand, loose and unhurried, he held a data slate. I didn't need to see the screen to know what was on it. I could feel it, the specific, nauseating gravity of being completely and irrevocably known. "You've been busy," he said. My mouth was dry. My hands were flat on the desk, because if I lifted them they would shake, and I refused. I absolutely refused to let him see that. "I don't know what you mean, enforcer." He looked at me for a long time. Long enough that the lights in the East Wing cycled through their automatic dim sequence. Long enough that somewhere below us, the building's overnight security doors sealed with a pressure hiss I felt more than heard. Long enough that I quietly, privately, accepted that I was going to die in this building on a Tuesday with half a protein ration still in my desk drawer. Then Kael Draven did something I had not once, in all my careful preparation and resistance training, anticipated. He reached past me, pressed 2 fingers against my terminal screen, and wiped it. Clean. Gone. He straightened, slid the data slate into his jacket, and when he looked at me again, something in his expression had shifted. Not softer, not warmer, nothing as readable as that, just different. Like a decision had been made in the space of those long, silent seconds that I hadn't been invited to participate in. "You're going to close your station," he said quietly. "You're going to follow me out of this building. And you are not going to make a sound." I stared at him. Why? The word came out before I could stop it. Small, stripped of everything except the raw disbelief underneath it. His gray eyes held mine, and for just a fraction of a second, barely long enough to be certain it was real, something moved through them that I had no name for. "Because," Kael Draven said, "they just issued a termination order, and your name is on it." He turned toward the stairwell. "So is mine. I have a rule about trust. I don't. It isn't cynicism, or maybe it is, but it's the earned kind, the kind that gets built quietly over years of watching the collective's promises dissolve the moment they stopped being convenient. Trust is a luxury that Omegas in the system learn to live without early. You trust the ration schedule because hunger is a reliable enforcer. You trust the curfew because the patrol units don't negotiate. You trust the suppression implant because the alternative is designation exposure and everything that follows. You do not trust people. People have agendas. People make calculations. People look at an Omega and see an asset or a liability and nothing in between. So when I followed Kael Draven into the stairwell of the Central Registry building at 2,200 hours on a Tuesday, with a termination order apparently floating somewhere in the collective system with my name attached to it, I want to be clear that I was not trusting him. I was making a calculation of my own. The calculation was simple. Every other option was worse. He moved fast, not running. Running in a collective building after curfew extension triggered automatic motion alerts, but a pace that ate distance efficiently, purposefully, like a man who had memorized the blind spots in every security grid before he ever set foot on the floor. I had to push to keep up, and I hated that. Hated the way it made the dynamic between us physical and obvious. This enforcer and his Omega, moving through the dark like I was something he was transporting. "Cameras on this stairwell," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Level 2 landing, upper left corner. Level 4 has 2, one on each side." He didn't slow down, didn't look back. "Already looped," he said. "Since when?" "Since this afternoon." I absorbed that. He had been in this building since this afternoon. He had walked these floors, mapped these corridors, identified me, confirmed his evidence, looped the security feeds, and I had sat at my terminal 3 floors above him pulling logistics manifests, completely unaware. 3 years of careful, patient, invisible work, and he had dismantled it in an afternoon without breaking a sweat. The humiliation of that sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. "You knew this afternoon," I said. "You could have taken me then." "Yes. Why didn't you?" He pushed through the ground-level door and said nothing. I followed him into the dark. The service corridor behind the registry ran parallel to Civic Meridian but sat below street level, accessible only through maintenance hatches and the kind of unmarked doors that administrative staff learned quickly not to ask about. It smelled like recycled air and old hydraulic fluid, the particular scent of infrastructure that the collective built to last and never bothered to clean. Kael moved through it like he had grown up in it. I stayed 2 steps behind him and cataloged everything I could. The way he carried himself, weight forward, shoulders loose, hands never far from his sides. The tactical jacket with its unmarked collar. The absence of a standard issue enforcement scanner on his belt, which meant either he had already logged off the registry network or he had never logged on. Both options were significant in different ways. I was still building the picture when he stopped without warning, and I nearly walked into his back. He held up one hand. Still, I froze. For 10 seconds there was nothing, just the low hum of the building's thermal cycling and the distant, muffled percussion of what I recognized, with a cold slide of dread, as enforcement boots on the street above us. A patrol, moving fast, not routine. The rhythm was wrong for routine, too urgent, too coordinated. They were looking for something. They were looking for us. Kael waited until the sound faded completely before he moved again, and this time he took a turn I hadn't anticipated. Not toward the outer maintenance exit I had mentally mapped, but deeper in, toward the utility junctions that serviced the building's lower infrastructure. "The east hatch is closer," I said quietly. "East hatch opens onto Meridian," he said. "Meridian is currently compromised. And you know this because I sent the patrol there." I stopped walking. He took 3 more steps before he realized I wasn't behind him, then turned and looked at me in the low amber glow of the emergency strips along the corridor floor. His expression didn't change. It never seemed to change. It was a face designed to give nothing away, trained or born that way. I couldn't tell which. "You sent them," I said slowly. "You deliberately routed an enforcement patrol to the exit point they would expect us to use." "Yes." "Which means someone on the network thinks you're still operating inside your mandate." "For approximately another 40 minutes. After that, the access logs will flag the camera loops and the picture will become considerably less favorable for both of us." 40 minutes. I looked at him. This man who was supposed to be the regime's most reliable weapon, who had a termination order on his own file and was standing in a maintenance corridor with a compromised Omega, he had every sanctioned reason to have already handed over, and I tried to find the shape of his logic. The angle, the thing he was getting out of this that justified the cost. "What did you do?" I asked. Something shifted in his jaw, almost imperceptible. "What I should have done 2 years ago," he said. And then, before I could pull that sentence apart and examine it the way it deserved. "Move, Solon." My name. My real name. Not my designation. Not my file number. Solon. I don't know why that was the thing that broke through the numbness. Not the termination order. Not the looped cameras. Not the patrol boots overhead. But hearing my own name in his voice, quiet and precise, like he had known it long before tonight, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to use it. I moved. The utility junction opened into a drainage channel that ran beneath Sector 4, part of the old water reclamation infrastructure that predated the collective's current grid by at least 60 years. It was low-ceilinged and damp and smelled like everything the city tried to forget about itself. Kael dropped into it first, then turned and, without asking, without hesitating, put his hands around my waist and lifted me down before I could manage the drop myself. He let go the instant my feet touched the ground, like he was aware of exactly how long was necessary and not a second more. I told myself the way my pulse spiked was adrenaline. We moved through the channel in silence for what I estimated was 6 minutes before it widened into a junction chamber. A circular space where 4 drainage arms met, dry enough to stand in properly, dark except for the pale blue bleed of Kael's tactical wrist display as he pulled it up and studied the screen. "There's a safe corridor exit at the north junction," he said. "Gets us to the outer sectors. Beyond the secondary wall." "Beyond the wall," I repeated. "There's nothing beyond the wall. That's what they tell you." I stared at him. "You've been beyond the wall." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I crossed my arms and looked at this man. This enforcer, this ghost breaker, this regime weapon with a death sentence now stapled to his file. And I asked the only question that actually mattered. "Why are you helping me?" Kael Draven looked up from his wrist display. In the blue light, his face was all angles and shadow, unreadable as always, carefully engineered to reveal exactly nothing. But his eyes held mine for just a beat too long. "I told you what I should have done 2 years ago," he said quietly. "What I should have done 2 years ago is found you sooner." He turned toward the north junction before I could respond. And the worst part, the part one would spend a long time trying to explain away, was that somewhere beneath the fear and the calculation and the cold survival logic I had been running since the moment he appeared behind my desk. I believed him. Nobody talks about what's beyond the wall because nobody who matters has ever been there. That's the collective's design. The wall isn't just infrastructure. It isn't just reinforced composite panels and motion sensor arrays and the kind of voltage that doesn't leave anything to bury. It's psychological architecture. It is the physical manifestation of a very simple message the collective has been broadcasting since the restructuring. Everything worth having is inside. Everything outside is absence. Darkness. Nothing. You internalize it young. You stop looking at the wall eventually. It becomes like the sky, something that simply exists above and around the edges of your life that you have no framework for questioning. Standing beneath the North Junction exit ladder with Kael Draven's hand braced against the hatch seal above me, I realized I had never once, in 3 years of resistance work, asked what we were actually fighting toward. I had fed information into the underground and never once asked what the underground was building on the other side. That felt like an important thing to have missed. The hatch opened into silence. Not the managed silence of the registry floor after hours. Not the enforced quiet of a curfew city holding its breath. This was something older and wider. The silence of space that hadn't been organized, scheduled, or surveilled. It pressed against my ears like a physical thing as I climbed out after Kael and straightened up and looked at what the collective had spent 40 years calling nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was dark, genuinely dark in a way that sector living never was. No grid lighting, no patrol beacons, no ambient glow from administrative towers bleeding into the low clouds. But there was ground, scrub vegetation pushing up through cracked civic substrate. The skeletal frames of structures that predated the collective, gutted and weathered but standing, their geometries strange and uncommented on, like architecture from a grammar the current city had forgotten how to speak. And there were stars. I hadn't seen stars since I was 7 years old, and my designation hadn't presented yet, and my mother had taken me to the outer edge of Sector 9 on a maintenance worker's access pass to watch a meteor shower that the collective weather control systems hadn't fully suppressed. I had forgotten about that night entirely. Standing here, outside the wall for the first time in my adult life, it came back to me complete and sudden, the way some memories do, fully rendered. The smell of her jacket and the cold of the concrete beneath us, and her voice saying, "Look up, soul, look up while you still can." I looked up now. "Move away from the hatch," Kael said quietly behind me. I moved. He resealed it from the outside with a tool I didn't recognize, something small and specialized that he pocketed without explanation, and then spent 60 seconds scanning the perimeter in a slow, methodical arc before he apparently decided we weren't immediately about to be executed. "How far?" I asked. 3 kilometers north." There's a way station, old water authority infrastructure. Resistance adjacent. They won't turn us away. Resistance adjacent. I filed that phrasing carefully. You know resistance contacts beyond the wall. I know a great many things I was not supposed to know, he said. He started walking north. It's a professional hazard. I fell into step beside him. Beside, not behind, because I had decided somewhere in the drainage channel that I was done performing the 2 steps back compliance choreography, termination order or not, and tried to map the architecture of what he had just admitted. An enforcer with resistance contacts. An enforcer who had spent this afternoon looping cameras and routing patrols and apparently deciding that tonight was the night he stopped being what the collective had made him. An enforcer who knew my real name. How long have you known about me? I asked. The scrub vegetation crunched softly under our feet. Above us the stars held perfectly still. 8 months, he said. 8 months. I did the math on that without meaning to. Calculated the number of data transfers, the number of Tuesday mornings at Oris's vendor stall, the number of nights I had walked home through Sector 12 feeling careful and invisible and safe. 8 months of that, and he had known. You let me keep working, I said. The realization didn't come with the anger I expected. It came with something stranger, a complicated, reluctant awe. You had confirmation for 8 months, and you let me keep feeding intelligence to the underground. Yes. Why? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. The way station had to be somewhere ahead in the dark. I couldn't see it yet, just the flat expanse of broken ground and the far-off geometric shadows of dead structures against the sky. Because what you were finding, he said finally, was material I needed found. And you were finding it faster than any asset I could have inserted. I stopped walking. He took 4 steps before he stopped too, and turned to look at me. You were running me, I said. No, you were using my access. My work. Everything I pulled for the resistance, you were reading it. Monitoring it. I was aware of it, he said carefully. That is not the same thing. That is absolutely the same thing. His jaw tightened slightly. The most expressive thing his face had done since the registry corridor. The intelligence you were gathering was exposing a program inside the collective that certain people very much wanted kept invisible. I needed it exposed. You were exposing it. Our interests aligned. Our interests, I repeated. The words tasted strange and sharp. And now? What are our interests now that we're both outside the wall with kill orders on our heads? He looked at me steadily. Now, he said, our interests are survival. And after survival, he paused. Something moved briefly through his expression, not quite discomfort, but the shadow of something he was choosing carefully. After survival, I intend to finish what the intelligence you gathered started. Which is what exactly? Dismantling the program entirely. His voice was flat and absolute. From the outside, I stared at him in the starlight. This man who had been my enemy, my unknowing handler, my executioner turned escort, and tried to locate the ground beneath this conversation because it kept shifting. You could have told me, I said. 8 months ago, you could have made contact. I considered it. What stopped you? Another pause. Longer this time. You were safer not knowing I existed, he said. And then, quieter, with a weight I didn't have a framework for yet. And I was less compromised, not knowing you beyond the file. The wind moved through the scrub around us, cold and directionless. Less compromised. I turned that phrase over carefully, looked at its edges, tried to understand exactly what kind of compromise he was describing. I didn't ask. Not yet. The question felt like something that needed more darkness and more distance before either of us was ready for its answer. I started walking again. He fell into step beside me. Beside, not ahead, and I noticed that, and told myself firmly that I was only noticing it tactically. The way station resolved out of the dark 20 minutes later. A low, broad structure, old enough that its corners had softened with weather, a faint light bleeding through a covered window on the eastern face. Kael slowed as we approached, produced a small signaling device from his jacket and sent 2 short pulses of light toward the covered window. A pause. 3 pulses returned. He exhaled, the first unreserved physical reaction I had seen from him, small and controlled but real, a fraction of tension leaving his shoulders. "We're expected?" I asked. "We're accepted," he said. Expected would have required more notice. The door opened before we reached it. A figure stood in the frame, slight, beta-built, wearing the kind of practical layered clothing that people wore when they had stopped caring about collective dress standards and started caring about warmth. A woman, older, with sharp eyes that moved from Kael to me and back again with the rapid assessment of someone who had spent a long time making fast decisions about who to trust and who to turn away. Her gaze settled on me. "Omega?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She studied me for a moment. Then she looked at Kael with an expression I couldn't fully decode. Something between exasperation and relief, and a third thing that looked almost like it might have been told you so. "You took your time," she said to him. Kael said nothing. She stepped back from the door and waved us in. "Both of you," she said. "Before the grid sweeps catch your heat signatures, and we have a very different kind of evening." I crossed the threshold. Behind me, Kael Draven followed, and when I glanced back at him in the warm amber light of the way station interior, I caught the tail end of an expression on his face that he hadn't managed to neutralize in time. Something that looked, impossibly, like relief. Not about the way station. Not about the door closing behind us and the cold outside. Something that looked like relief about me. I faced forward and said nothing, but I felt it settle in my chest like a coal, small and quiet and inconveniently warm. Her name was Vesa. She didn't offer a last name. Outside the wall, I would learn quickly, last names were either dead weight or dangerous, and the people who lived beyond the collective's grid had made a practical religion out of traveling light. She gave us her first name the way she gave us everything else in those first 20 minutes, efficiently, without ceremony, with the brisk competence of a woman who had long since stopped performing hospitality and simply provided it. Ration packs on the table. Water, real water, not processed municipal issue. A heat source in the corner radiating steady warmth. 2 bedrolls in the back room, separated by a structural dividing wall, which she pointed out specifically and without comment in a way that told me she was a woman who noticed things and chose her silences deliberately. I liked her immediately and didn't entirely trust that instinct. "Eat," she said, dropping into the chair across from the table and looking at us both with those quick, calibrating eyes. "You won't be useful to anyone hollow." Kael sat. I sat. We ate. The ration pack was military surplus, not collective issue, something older, something from a supply chain I didn't recognize. The protein was better than registry standard, and the caloric density was noticeably higher, the kind of nutritional profile designed for people operating under sustained physical stress. Someone with logistical knowledge had stocked this place. Someone who understood field conditions. I filed that. "How bad is it?" Kael asked. Vesa's expression didn't shift. "The order came through Central Command 4 hours ago. Both designations flagged. Yours and the Omegas. They're calling it a joint defection." "Joint defection," I repeated. "You ran together." "As far as the collective's narrative is concerned, that makes it collaborative." She picked up her own water container, turned it in her hands without drinking. "It's actually better for us, strategically. A defecting enforcer alone reads as isolated malfunction. An enforcer defecting with a registered Omega reads as conspiracy, which means they'll assume there's more of it. More cells, more coordination. They'll pull resources inward, trying to map a network that doesn't exist yet." "Yet," Kael said. "Yet," Vesa agreed. Something passed between them, a look that carried the weight of a much longer conversation, the kind of understanding that only builds over years of operating in the same dark. I watched it and felt the outline of a history I hadn't been given access to. "How long have you two known each other?" I asked. Vesa glanced at me. Then at Kael. Long enough, she said. Kael said nothing, which had started to feel like its own dialect, a language of deliberate omission that I was slowly learning to translate. After the food, Vesa showed me to the back room and gave me a change of clothes, plain, dark, practical, and a small kit for the suppression implant maintenance that I hadn't thought about until she handed it to me, and my body reminded me sharply that stress accelerated metabolic cycling, and I was running dangerously close to the edge of my last calibration window. I sat on the bedroll with the kit in my lap and tried to remember the last time someone had anticipated what I needed without being asked. I couldn't. I ran the maintenance cycle with the small applicator tool, felt the familiar cold then neutral sensation as the implant recalibrated, and told myself the way my hands had started shaking slightly was just the adrenaline wearing off. The crash after sustained high-stress operation. Normal. Physiological. Nothing to examine more closely. Through the dividing wall, I could hear Vesa and Kael speaking in low voices. Not quite low enough. Or maybe I was listening harder than I meant to. "You waited too long," Vesa said. Not accusatory. Just factual. "I managed the timeline," Kael said. "You managed your own hesitation and called it a timeline." Silence. "He's operational?" she asked. "Mentally, I mean. Not designation compromised." A longer pause. "He's the sharpest person I've encountered in 3 years of field work," Kael said. "Designation has nothing to do with it." I stopped breathing for a moment. "That's not what I asked," Vesa said quietly. "I know," said Kael, and said nothing else. I set the maintenance kit down very carefully, lay back on the bedroll, and stared at the low ceiling of the way station with my heart doing something complicated and inconvenient in my chest. Designation compromised. It was collective language, clinical, systemic, designed to describe the phenomenon of an alpha whose judgment became impaired through proximity to a specific omega. A bonding precursor response. Involuntary chemistry. The kind of thing that the collective suppression infrastructure was specifically designed to prevent because it disrupted operational efficiency. The kind of thing that, outside the suppression grid, with implants running at the edge of their calibration window, became considerably harder to chemically manage. I was not going to think about that. I was going to sleep. I closed my eyes and did neither. I don't know what hour it was when I heard him sit down on the other side of the dividing wall. There was no door in the frame, just the structural partition, open at the top, the way station too old and too practical for interior doors that served no load-bearing purpose. The amber light from the main room had dropped to a dim maintenance glow. Vesa was either asleep or absent. The quality of the silence had changed. I heard him settle, the soft displacement of weight against the wall. I lay still and said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. "I know you're awake," he said. Low, not unkind. Enforcer instinct. "You breathe differently when you're asleep." I stared at the ceiling. "You know how I breathe when I'm asleep." "I've been watching your file for 8 months," he said. "Surveillance includes a great deal of incidental data." That is a deeply uncomfortable thing to say. Yes. A pause. "I'm aware." I turned onto my side, facing the partition wall, even though I couldn't see him through it. The gesture was irrational. I made it anyway. "The program," I said. "The one the intelligence I gathered was exposing." "What is it?" The silence stretched long enough that I thought he was going to deflect again, retreat into one of those deliberate omissions, and leave me holding a partial picture I couldn't complete. Then he said, "Designation reassignment." I went very still. "That's not possible," I said. "Designation is biological. It's chemical," he said. "The collective has known that for 20 years. Designation is a hormonal profile, complex, multisystemic, but ultimately addressable through targeted pharmaceutical intervention if you begin early enough in the development cycle." His voice was controlled, and I could hear underneath it, if I listened carefully, the specific exhaustion of someone carrying something for a very long time. They've been running a covert program for 11 years, identifying high-potential beta children in lower sectors. chemically inducing alpha designation, producing enforcers, administrators, military assets, built to specification, on demand, without waiting for natural presentation. The ceiling above me seemed to recede slightly. How many? I asked. Current estimates inside the program files, approximately 4,000 active subjects, possibly more in early phase cohorts. The resistance knows about this? Parts of it, not the full scope. Another pause. The documents you pulled from the archive Q6 weeks ago, the medical requisitions flagged for deletion. Those were the closest anyone outside the program has gotten to the pharmaceutical supply chain. That was the night I decided the timeline couldn't hold any longer. I lay there in the dark and let the scale of it move through me. Not panic, not outrage, something colder and more structural. The collective wasn't just managing designation. It was manufacturing it, building a human infrastructure to its own specifications, invisible inside the biology of people who didn't know what had been done to them. You were one of them, I said. It wasn't a question. It landed in the silence and stayed there. Kael didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was exactly the same, controlled, even carefully maintained. I was the first, he said. The way station hummed quietly around us. Outside, beyond the wall, the world the collective called nothing held its stars in place and waited. I had no words adequate to what he had just handed me. This man who had been built and branded and deployed, and who had spent 8 months watching me dismantle the edges of the system that made him. I said the only thing that felt true. I'm sorry, I said. Another silence, longer than the others. Go to sleep, Solon, he said softly. I did, and for the first time in 3 years, for months and 11 days, I felt something that was dangerously close to safe. I woke up angry. Not the slow, disoriented kind of anger that builds after a bad dream. The immediate, fully formed kind that meant some part of my brain had been working through the night and had arrived at conclusions my conscious mind hadn't been consulted on. I lay on the bedroll for exactly 4 seconds, stared at the dividing wall, and felt the shape of everything Kael Draven had told me in the dark settle into its permanent place in my understanding of the world. Then I got up, walked into the main room, and said, "You used me." Kael was already awake. Of course he was. He was seated at the table with a tactical map spread across the surface, a cold ration pack open at his elbow, studying something with the same focused, infuriating calm he applied to everything. He looked up when I spoke. "Good morning," he said. "Don't." I crossed my arms. 8 months. You had 8 months to make contact, to tell me what you knew, to give me any fragment of actual context for what I was doing. And instead you sat in the dark and monitored me and let me keep pulling documents that served your agenda while I thought I was serving the resistance. I could feel the heat of it in my jaw, my throat, the precise articulation of an anger that had been composting overnight into something clean and structural. That is the definition of using someone. He set down the stylus he'd been holding, gave me his full attention, which was somehow more aggravating than being dismissed would have been. "Yes," he said. I waited for the qualifier. The however, the but, the carefully constructed contextual framework that would reposition his choices as strategic necessities I was too emotionally compromised to appreciate. It didn't come. "That's it," I said. "Just yes. What else would you like me to say?" "I would like you to say something that helps me understand why I shouldn't walk back out that hatch and take my chances with the patrol grid rather than spend another hour operating as an asset in an agenda I still only have partial information about." Something moved in his jaw. That microscopic tightening that I was beginning to recognize as the external surface of an internal recalculation. "The patrol grid would kill you in under an hour," he said. "That's not an answer. That's a threat dressed as a fact." "It's both," he said. "Sit down, Solon." "I'll stand." A beat. He looked at me for a moment with something in his expression that might have been frustration or might have been something else entirely. It was genuinely difficult to tell with a face that had been professionally engineered to reveal nothing. Fine, he said. Stand. Vesa appeared from somewhere at the back of the structure with the energy of a woman who had heard everything and was choosing to pretend she hadn't. She produced 2 cups of something hot. Not real coffee. Nothing that luxurious. But a synthetic dark liquid that smelled like coffee had a distant and impoverished cousin, and set them on the table without comment. The eastern corridor is clear until 0900, she said to Kael. After that, the grid sweep cycles back. If you're moving today, you have a window. We're not moving today, Kael said. We're not. I said. He looked at me. You're not at full suppression calibration. Moving through open terrain with a compromised implant is. I ran the maintenance cycle last night. A maintenance cycle manages acute symptoms. It doesn't restore full calibration after the kind of sustained stress load you've been running for the past 12 hours. His voice was flat and clinical and absolutely maddening. 24 hours minimum. Then we move. I picked up one of the cups of synthetic coffee and looked at him over the rim of it. Here is something I want to make very clear to you, I said pleasantly. I have been managing my own designation biology, my own suppression schedule, and my own operational capacity for 3 years without your input or supervision. I did not require a handler then. I do not require one now. You had a grid infrastructure supporting your implant then, he said. Out here, the ambient suppression field doesn't exist. Your biology is operating in conditions it hasn't been exposed to since before your first implant calibration. A pause. When was that? I'm not answering that. Solon. 14. I said, because the alternative was letting him sit with the question unanswered, and for some reason that felt worse. I was 14. Something crossed his face so quickly I almost missed it. Not pity. I would have had a visceral reaction to pity. Something quieter and harder than pity. Something that looked like it had weight. Then your baseline has been chemically managed for over a decade, he said. In an uncontrolled environment, your body doesn't know how to. I am aware of my own physiology, thank you. Then act like it and give it 24 hours. I set the cup down harder than necessary. Vesa, to her credit, found something extremely important to examine on the far side of the room. The 24 hours were interminable. The way station was not a large structure. It had the main room, the divided back quarters, a utility space at the rear that housed Vesa's equipment and supply stores, and approximately 40 square meters of total floor space that I spent the better part of the morning becoming intimately familiar with while aggressively not speaking to Kael Draven. He seemed entirely unbothered by the silence. This was, itself, bothersome. I spent 2 hours with Vesa instead, partly because she was more forthcoming than her counterpart, and partly because I had decided that the partial information problem needed addressing immediately, and she was clearly a better source than a man who delivered revelations like a controlled pharmaceutical drip, measured doses, maximum impact, minimum context. How long has the way station been operational? I asked her. 6 years. Resistance funded. Resistance adjacent, she said, echoing Kael's phrasing from the night before with a small, knowing emphasis that told me the distinction mattered to her. We cooperate where interests align. We don't report to a cell structure. I noted. She glanced at me sideways. There are others. Not here. Distributed. People Kael recruited? People Kael found, she said carefully, who had already found their own way out. I turned that over. How many of them are like him? Program subjects. Vesa was quiet for a moment. She was sorting through a supply inventory with her hands, her eyes moving over containers and packages in a rapid, practiced way. Enough, she said. That's not a number. No, she agreed. It isn't. I looked at her directly. Why won't anyone in this building give me a complete sentence? She stopped sorting, looked at me with those sharp, measuring eyes, and for a moment I thought she was going to deflect again, retreat into the careful ellipses that seemed to be the primary communication style of everyone operating outside the wall. Instead, she said, Because the complete sentences are his to give, and he hasn't figured out yet that you can handle them. I opened my mouth. Don't argue with me about that, she said mildly. Argue with him. I found him at the eastern end of the way station in the late afternoon, where a narrow gap in the composite paneling served as a sight line across the outer terrain. He was watching the middle distance with the particular focused stillness of someone running threat assessment. Not paranoid, not anxious, just perpetually operational. A man who had been trained so thoroughly that even rest looked like preparation. I stood beside him and looked at the same expanse of broken ground and scrub and far-off dead structures and said nothing for approximately 90 seconds, which was about 70 seconds longer than I had expected to last. How many? I said. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. Confirmed program subjects outside the wall, 31. Suspected but unconfirmed, perhaps double that. And inside, still in the collective? Still operating as enforcers and administrators without knowing what was done to them. Thousands, he said. The word landed like something dropped from a height. They don't know, I said. Most of them don't. A few suspect. Fewer still have found enough documentation to confirm it. He paused. It's difficult to process the information that your entire biological identity was manufactured. People tend to reject it initially. How long did it take you? A beat. Longer than his other pauses. Longer than I'd like to admit. How did you find out? His jaw tightened. There it was, that tell, that microscopic surface resistance that meant I was pushing against something he hadn't decided to give yet. Under the old dynamic, I might have eased off, softened the approach, let him offer it in his own time. Instead, I turned and looked directly at him and waited. He felt it, the refusal to retreat. His eyes moved from the sight line to my face, and he studied me with an expression that was doing something complicated. A woman in the medical division, he said finally, pulled the words out like they were load-bearing. She had been inside the program from its early phase. She developed a conscience approximately 5 years too late and started leaving documentation where it could be found. He paused. She was terminated 18 months ago when internal security identified the leak. I'm sorry, I said. Don't, he said. And the word came out with an edge I hadn't heard from him before. Not anger at me, something rawer than that. I recalibrated. What was her name? The question clearly surprised him. He looked at me like I had approached from an unexpected direction. Marin, he said. Quiet. Just the one word. But the way he said it carried the entire weight of what she had been to him. Not a romance. Not from the timbre of it. Something more foundational than that. A person who had handed him the truth about himself and paid for it. She's why you let me keep working, I said. Not a question this time either. He was silent for a long moment. She believed the program could be dismantled from inside the data, he said. That if the right documentation reached the right people, the whole infrastructure would collapse under the weight of its own exposure. His voice had gone very flat. She died before she could finish what she started. So you found someone who could. I found you, he said. And then, like the admission had surprised even him, he stopped, looked back out at the terrain, reset his expression into its usual controlled neutrality. But the reset took longer than usual. And I stood beside him in the narrow amber light of the late afternoon and felt the anger from this morning's shift, not dissolve, not forgive, but shift, rearrange itself around a more complete picture, the way understanding always complicates the clean lines of a grievance. I was still angry, but the anger had context now. Next time, I said, you tell me things before I have to extract them. He looked at me sidelong. Is that a condition? It's a requirement, I said. We're apparently dismantling a state program together from a 40-square-meter way station beyond the wall. The least you can do is brief me like a partner instead of managing me like an asset. A silence. Then, quietly, with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something fragile on an uncertain surface. Agreed, he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't any of the soft emotional currencies I had spent 3 years deciding I didn't need. It was a concession, given without theater, from a man who did not concede easily. Somehow that meant more. I looked back out at the broken world beyond the wall and said nothing else. Neither did he. But he didn't move away. And neither did I. The grid sweep came back early. Not by much, 11 minutes, according to Vessa's instruments, which she was watching with the focused intensity of a woman recalculating every assumption she had made about the morning's timeline. 11 minutes wasn't a catastrophic deviation. It was, however, the kind of deviation that meant someone had adjusted the patrol algorithm, and patrol algorithms didn't get adjusted without a reason, and the most likely reason was that the collective had narrowed their search radius. "They're closer than we thought," Vessa said. Not panicked. Informational. "How much closer?" Kael asked. "Close enough that staying through tonight is no longer a conversation we're having." She was already moving, pulling supply packs from the utility room, compact and pre-assembled, the kind of preparation that told me she had done this before, packed this way station down under pressure, and moved without looking back. "The eastern corridor is compromised. Northern route through the dead sectors is your best option." "The dead sectors," I said. "The pre-collective infrastructure. What's left of it, yes." I looked at Kael. "How far?" "Far enough that we won't make it before dark," he said. He was studying the tactical map, had it rolled and secured before I finished processing the sentence. "We move now. We reach the outer edge of the dead sectors by nightfall. There's shelter inside. Vessa's people have maintained access points. And after the dead sectors, there's a relay station, 15 kilometers beyond. Functional communications array, the only one outside the collective's network in this region." He met my eyes. "From there we can transmit the program documentation to every resistance cell operating in the outer districts simultaneously." I absorbed that. "You have the documentation." "I've had it for 6 months. I stared at him. "You've had the complete documentation for 6 months, I said, with the careful enunciation of someone ensuring that every word lands with its full weight. "And the plan was always to transmit it from the relay station." "Yes. And you needed my archive pulls because what I had documented the program's existence," he said. "What you pulled documented the pharmaceutical supply chain, the manufacturing infrastructure, the distribution network. Without that, the documentation proves the program exists but can't prove its operational scope." He held my gaze steadily. "What you found is the difference between an allegation and a case." I breathed in slowly through my nose. "You are going to stop doing that," I said. "Doing what?" "Delivering information in installments like you're rationing it. Like I need to be managed toward conclusions rather than given the full picture and trusted to handle it." I picked up the supply pack Vessa had set near the table without being asked, checked its weight, adjusted the strap. "We had an agreement. Brief me like a partner." "I am briefing you." "You're briefing me because operational necessity has made it unavoidable. That is not the same thing, and you know it." I pulled the strap across my shoulder and looked at him with the full direct attention I had learned overnight made him recalibrate. "Is there anything else I don't know that I should?" "A beat." Kael held my gaze, and I could see the assessment happening behind his eyes, the rapid internal inventory of what to give and what to hold. And I kept my expression flat and expectant and gave him absolutely nothing to read. He reached into the inner panel of his tactical jacket and produced a secondary data chip. Set it on the table between us. "The names of every confirmed program subject inside the collective's current enforcement division," he said, "cross-referenced with their assigned operational mandates." I looked at the chip, then at him. "How many of them know?" 14. "The rest are still operating blind." "And the 14 who know, are they assets or liabilities when we transmit?" He blinked. Just once, barely perceptible, but I caught it. The microscopic surprise of a man who had expected a different question and received instead the one that cut directly to the tactical core. "Assets," he said. "If the transmission goes out correctly, they'll have cover to move. Then we need a secondary signal embedded in the transmission." I said. Something only a program subject would recognize. A way of telling them the exposure is controlled, that it's a rescue, not a detonation. Kael was very still. I hadn't built that into the transmission protocol, he said. I know, I said. Build it in. Vesa, from the doorway of the utility room, made a sound that might have been a cough and was almost certainly something else entirely. We left the way station 40 minutes later. Vesa stayed. The way station needed a controlled shutdown, she said, with the brisk finality of someone who had also said a great many other things with that same tone and meant all of them. She handed Kael a secondary comm unit, gripped my forearm briefly with both hands when she said goodbye to me, and looked at me with those sharp eyes that always seemed to be reading 3 sentences ahead of the one being spoken. He's not good at this, she said quietly. At what? She gave me a look that suggested the question didn't need answering. He's also not wrong, she added, about the things that matter. Then she let go of my arm, stepped back, and said, louder, to both of us, the northern route. Stay in the shadow corridors, the dead zones between the old sensor arrays. You'll see the geometry when you get there. Trust the geometry. Trust the geometry, I repeated. You'll understand when you see it, she said. Go. We went. The terrain north of the way station was different from the open scrubland we had crossed the night before. Less open, more articulated, the ground starting to buckle and fold around the buried infrastructure of the pre-collective city. Foundations beneath the surface. Old transit conduits. The geological memory of a place that had been built over rather than cleared. The collective's grid pressed down on top of something older that kept pressing back up through the soil in ridges and depressions, and the occasional fractured edge of material that caught the gray morning light and threw it back wrong. It was eerily beautiful in a way I didn't have time to process. Kael set the pace, measured, sustainable, the same efficient ground-eating stride from the maintenance corridor. I matched it without effort and didn't comment on the fact that he adjusted it slightly, almost imperceptibly, somewhere in the first 20 minutes. Fractionally slower. Not patronizing, calibrated. The difference between a pace set for one person and a pace set for 2. I noticed it and decided not to make it into a conversation. We moved mostly in silence. Functional silence, not hostile. The kind that had a specific texture, occupied by the sound of ground under boots and whine through the scrub and the distant, intermittent percussion of the collective's patrol drones running their grid sweeps somewhere to the southeast. Far enough. For now. The signal, I said after the first hour. For the program subjects inside the enforcement division. What are you thinking? A numeric sequence embedded in the transmission header, he said. Something that reads as formatting data to a standard analysis filter, but carries meaning to someone who knows what to look for. What sequence? He was quiet for a moment. The program's internal designation code. The one they use to flag subject files in the medical registry. A pause. Every subject who's accessed their own file, legally or otherwise, would have seen it. Have they all accessed their files? The 14 who know, yes. It was how they found out. Something shifted in his voice. Flat as always, but carrying that particular density that meant the words were load-bearing. It was how I found out. Marin left the access pathway in a system I used routinely. I found my own file on a Tuesday morning at 0600 and spent 4 hours in a utility corridor before I could stand up and walk back to my post. I kept walking, kept my eyes on the terrain ahead. And then, I asked, and then I went back to work, he said, because I didn't know yet what else to do. How long before you knew? 3 months. A beat. I spent 3 months working inside a system I had decided to destroy, maintaining a performance of loyalty I no longer felt, surrounded by people who had no idea what had been done to them or to me. Another pause. Quieter. It required a very particular kind of compartmentalization. I know something about that, I said. He glanced at me sideways. Brief. Almost immediately forward again. Yes, he said. I know you do. We reached the edge of the dead sectors in the late afternoon, when the light had gone that particular flat gray that preceded the full dark. Not sunset exactly, just the sky deciding it was finished. Vesa had said to trust the geometry. I understood what she meant the moment I saw it. The pre-collective structures rose from the ground at the angles of a different architectural logic, not the collective's rigid perpendicular grids, not the enforced symmetry of civic infrastructure designed to signal control. These buildings had been built by people who were interested in other things. Curves, cantilevers, structures that leaned into each other at odd, organic angles, creating shadow corridors between them that the collective's aerial surveillance geometry would read as dead zones. Angles that broke line of sight, confused thermal mapping, created pockets of invisible space that the grids simply could not resolve. Trust the geometry. The shadow corridors were exactly where Vesa had implied they would be. We moved into the first one, and the quality of the air changed. Sheltered, still, the ambient noise of the outside terrain dropping away. We were 3 structures deep into the dead sectors when Kael stopped. He held up one hand, still, and I stopped immediately, reading the tension in his posture before I consciously registered it. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard it. A drone. Close. Closer than the southeastern grid sweep had any reason to be, and moving in the specific search pattern, wide arcs narrowing toward a center point. That meant it wasn't running a routine sweep. It was actively tracking something. Tracking us. Kael moved without announcing the plan, stepped behind me, took hold of my arm, and pulled me sideways into a narrow gap between 2 leaning structures, a space barely wide enough for one person that we were apparently filling with 2, and pressed us both flat against the cold composite surface. I opened my mouth. He put one hand against the wall beside my head, angled his body to cover the gap from the outside, and looked down at me with an expression that said very clearly, "Do not make a sound." I said nothing. For approximately 30 seconds. The drone passed overhead. Slow. Methodical. Its scanned beam swept the shadow corridor outside our gap with a pale blue light that moved across the ground 3 meters from where we were standing like a searchlight dragged through water. It paused, directly outside. I stopped breathing. Kael went completely, absolutely still. Not rigid, not tense. The opposite of that. The kind of stillness that was itself a practice skill, the ability to occupy space without disturbing it, to exist without announcing it. His body was warm against the cold of the structure. His arm was braced beside my head. He wasn't looking at the drone. He was looking at me. I looked back at him because there was nowhere else to look in 30 centimeters of space. And in the pale blue wash of the drone's scan light, his face was close and unguarded in a way I had not yet seen it. Not because his expression had changed, but because proximity at this scale removes the option of managed distance. You cannot calculate someone from 30 centimeters. You can only see them. He was looking at me the way he had stood beside me at the sight line the day before, with the particular quality of attention that was becoming the most consistently disorienting thing about him. Like I was something he had been looking at for a very long time and had not yet finished resolving. The drone moved on. The blue light retracted. The sound of it tracked northeast and diminished and was gone. Neither of us moved immediately. The rational thing, the operationally sound, tactically appropriate thing, was to step out of the gap, reassess the route, continue moving toward the relay station while the window was open. I was aware of all of that. I was also aware that his hand had moved at some point during the last 90 seconds from the wall beside my head to the edge of my shoulder, and that neither of us had commented on it, and neither of us was moving away. "We need to move," I said. "Yes," he said. He didn't move. "Kael." "I'm aware," he said quietly. His eyes held mine for one beat too long. The same beat too long as the registry corridor, as the drainage channel, as every moment in the last 48 hours where he had looked at me like I was something he hadn't solved yet and wasn't willing to stop trying. Then he stepped back, out of the gap, into the shadow corridor. Operationally correct. Tactically sound. I followed him out and said nothing. But my shoulder was warm where his hand had been, and the warmth didn't fade the way the cold should have replaced it. And I walked the next kilometer with my jaw set and my eyes forward, and the feeling of being comprehensively, inconveniently, and entirely against my will, sitting in my chest like something I had no system for processing. I was furious about it, which was, of course, completely useless information. We reached the outer edge of the dead sectors as the dark came fully down. The relay station, a distant point of faint light on the northern horizon. Reachable, visible, real. Tomorrow morning, Kael said. Tomorrow morning, I agreed. We found shelter in one of the old structures, a low interior space, wind-sealed by accident of geometry, dry enough. 2 bedrolls from the supply packs. The tactical map between us on the floor. The data chip with the program documentation beside it. The secondary comm unit charged and ready. Everything we needed to finish what Marin had started, laid out in a 40-year-old room beyond the collective's wall. I looked at it all. Then I looked at him. After tomorrow, I said, when the transmission goes out and the program is exposed, what happens to you? He met my eyes. That depends, he said carefully, on a number of variables. What variables? He looked at me for a long moment. That look, that infuriating, unresolved, 30 centimeters in the dark look. On whether the people I'm choosing to trust, he said quietly, turn out to be worth trusting. The comm unit hummed softly on the floor between us. Outside, the dead city held its geometry around us like cupped hands. I held his gaze and said nothing. And this time, when the silence stretched, I let it. I didn't sleep well. Not because of the cold, though the old structure had its own relationship with temperature that no amount of tactical bedroll insulation fully resolved. Not because of the hard floor, or the wind working its way through the geometry of the dead city outside, or the distant, intermittent sound of patrol drones running their grids somewhere to the south. I didn't sleep well because Kael Draven was 6 feet away in the dark and I had run out of useful things to be angry about. That was the problem. Anger had been functional. It had kept things clear, kept the boundaries between us legible, kept me from examining too closely the architecture of what was actually happening in the space between his silences and my extractions, and every moment where he had put himself between me and harm without announcing it, without asking for acknowledgement, without making it into anything other than a simple, operational fact. Anger requires a clean target. The problem with understanding someone, really understanding them, the shape of what made them and what it cost them and what they were still choosing despite that cost, is that it ruins the clean target entirely. I lay in the dark and stared at the old ceiling and accepted, with the grim practicality of a man who had spent 3 years being honest with himself about uncomfortable things, that I was in serious trouble. Not the patrol grid kind. The worst kind. He was awake before dawn. I heard him move, careful, quiet, the specific quality of someone trying not to wake the other person in the room, and lay still with my eyes open and listened to him run through what I had come to recognize as his pre-operational routine. The soft, systematic check of equipment. The tactical map, reviewed in near silence. The comm unit, powered and tested with one short pulse that returned a green confirmation. Then quiet. I sat up. He looked at me across the dark room. Neither of us said anything for a moment. That particular early morning silence that exists before the day's logic reasserts itself, before the operational framework clicks back into place, and you remember what you are to each other and why. The transmission window opens in 40 minutes, he said. Then we should move, I said. We moved. The relay station was exactly what Vesa had described and nothing more. A pre-collective communications installation, stripped of everything non-essential by decades of disuse. The antenna array on its roof still functional in the specific, stubborn way that old infrastructure sometimes outlasted everything built to replace it. The access door required Kael's override tool and 40 seconds of patient coaxing. The interior smelled like sealed air and old composite and the particular metallic undertone of equipment that had been waiting a long time to be useful again. The console was manual. No network integration. Physically impossible to trace. Impossible to intercept through the collective's standard monitoring architecture because it operated on a frequency band the collective had officially declared obsolete and stopped scanning 8 years ago. Marin, I thought, had probably known that. Kael plugged in the primary data chip, brought up the transmission protocol. His fingers moved across the console with the practiced efficiency of someone who had run this sequence in his head many times before, and I watched his hands and thought about all the months he had spent carrying this toward a moment he wasn't certain he would reach. The secondary signal, I said. The sequence for the program subjects. Embedded in the header. He pulled up the protocol display and showed me. The numeric string nested inside the formatting data. Invisible to standard analysis. Unmistakable to anyone who had seen their own program file. It reads as a transmission artifact to the collective's filters. To the 14 inside, it reads as a door. I studied it. Add a coordinate string after the sequence. He looked at me. The way station is compromised, I said. They need somewhere to go. Give them the dead sectors, the shadow corridor entry point. Vesse's people know this territory. If the transmission does what it's supposed to do, those 14 are going to need to move fast, and they need a destination. Kael held my gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the console and added the coordinate string without argument. No installment. No management. Just done. Ready, he said. I looked at the console. At the data chip. At 3 years of careful, patient, invisible work sitting in a transmission queue in a pre-collective relay station 40 minutes walk from where the collective had decided there was nothing worth caring about. Send it, I said. He pressed the transmission key. For a moment, nothing happened, just the soft, cycling hum of the antenna array drawing power, the console display ticking through its protocol sequence. Then the progress indicator began to move, steady and irreversible, and somewhere above us the old antenna was doing what it had been built to do, pushing signal out into the world with the blunt, patient persistence of infrastructure that had never been told it was obsolete. We stood side by side and watched it. The transmission took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it completed, the console produced a single confirmation tone, low, undramatic, the kind of sound that had no idea it was historic, and the progress indicator settled at 100%. Done. Marin's documentation. My archive pulls. Kael's 6 months of compiled evidence. Out in the world now, irrevocable, moving toward every resistant cell in the outer districts with the weight of everything that had been done to thousands of people who hadn't known, who still didn't know, who were going to wake up tomorrow in a different world than the one they went to sleep in. I breathed out. Beside me, Kael was very still. It's done, I said. Yes, he said. I turned and looked at him. This man who had been manufactured by the system we had just detonated, who had spent years performing loyalty to something that had built him without his consent and deployed him without his knowledge, who had spent the last 18 months working in the dark toward a moment that looked, from the outside, like a suicide run and was maybe something else entirely. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on the console display. He looked like a man standing at the end of something very long and not yet certain what the ground felt like on the other side. Hey, I said. He looked at me. She would have called it sufficient, I said. Marin, what we just did. She would have called it sufficient. Something happened in his face that I had not seen before. Not the jaw tightening, not the microscopic recalibration, not the carefully managed neutrality he deployed like armor. Something that moved through his expression and didn't get stopped in time. Something that was grief and relief and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding something at arm's length for so long that putting it down feels like a collapse. He turned away from me, toward the console. I reached out and put my hand on his arm. He went still, not the operational stillness. The other kind the kind I had only seen in the gap between the structures with the drone lights sweeping outside, when proximity had stripped the managed distance and left something undefended underneath. You don't have to do that, I said. Do what? Reset, I said. I've watched you do it for 4 days. Every time something gets through, you reset. Lock it back down. Go flat. I kept my hand where it was and looked at the side of his face and said the thing I had been not saying since the maintenance corridor on the first night. You don't have to do it with me. He was quiet for a long time. I don't know how not to, he said. It came out low and stripped of everything. No control, no calculation. Just the bare, factual admission of a man who had been built for function and had run on function for so long that anything else felt like malfunction. I know, I said. We'll figure it out. Though we landed in the air between us, and neither of us pretended it hadn't. He turned to face me, looked at me with that look, that 30 centimeters look, that fully unmanaged look. And this time there was no drone to break it, no operational necessity to use as an exit, no installment he could deliver to redirect the moment somewhere safer. Just the relay station, the old hum of the console, the confirmed transmission sitting in the log, and the two of us on the other side of everything. I looked at your file for 8 months, he said quietly. Before that I looked for 2 years, trying to find the leak, running the analysis, following the data threads. You were very good. Every time I thought I had a line on the source, you'd already moved. I spent 6 months being professionally frustrated by someone I hadn't met. A pause. Then I found you. And he stopped, assembled the next words carefully, like a man handling something he didn't want to damage. I told myself I was managing an asset, that the decision to let you keep working was tactical, that the 8 months was operational patience. Was it? I asked. No, he said. It wasn't. What was it? His eyes held mine. I didn't want to end it, he said. Your work, your access, the 10-day transfers. The way you moved through that building like you owned every secret in it. Something very close to something moved in his expression. I told myself I was protecting an intelligence pipeline. What I was actually doing was waiting, I said. Yes. For what? He looked at me for a long moment. For a reason good enough to move, he said. And then the termination order came through with your name on it, and I had been waiting for 8 months, and I was done waiting. I looked at this man, built without consent, deployed without knowledge, carrying the weight of Marin's death and 4,000 people who didn't know what had been done to them, who had spent 2 years circling me at a distance and 8 months holding the moment in place until he couldn't anymore. And I felt something settle in my chest that was entirely different from the cold warmth of the first night. This was structural, load-bearing. The kind of feeling that doesn't ask permission and doesn't respond to sarcasm and doesn't care at all that you have spent 3 years deciding you don't need people. You are, I said, the single most complicated person I have ever encountered. I know, he said. I mean that as a genuine criticism. I know that too. And I stopped. Started again. Whatever this is. Whatever has been happening since the maintenance corridor. I don't do this. I don't. Neither do I, he said. We're going to be terrible at it. Probably, he said. And then, quiet, careful, placed with the same deliberateness as every admission he had made since the first night, the ones that cost him visibly and came out anyway. I'd like to be terrible at it regardless. I looked at him. He looked at me. And then I closed the distance between us and kissed him. Not gently, not tentatively, not with any of the soft choreography of people who have been circling each other warmly. Hard and certain, with the full weight of 4 days and 8 months and 2 years of circling behind it. And he met it without hesitation, without reset, without the managed distance collapsing this time, because there was no managed distance left to collapse. His hand came up to the side of my face and stayed there like it had always known where it belonged. When we broke apart, I looked at him and his expression was different. Still him, still the angled stillness, still the gray eyes that calculated everything. But underneath it, visible, Now the way a light is visible through a crack it has always been shining through, something open. Something that hadn't been there before the way station, before the drainage channel, before a Tuesday night in a registry building where he had looked at me for a very long time and made a decision that changed everything for both of us. We still need to get back to Vesa, I said. Yes, he said. And there are 31 confirmed program subjects who are going to need coordination when the transmission hits the cells. Yes. And the collective is going to respond to the exposure, and we need a counter strategy for when they do. Yes, he said. A pause. Are you going to keep listing operational priorities? I'm establishing that this, I gestured between us, doesn't mean I stop being an asset who demands full briefings and complete sentences. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Kael Draven was not, I suspected, a man who smiled easily or often, but the precursor to one, the structural shift of a face deciding that expression might be worth attempting. Understood, he said. Good, I said. Then let's go. We walked back through the dead sectors in the early morning light, the gray sky beginning to lighten at its edges, the old structures casting their geometry around us in long, unfamiliar shadows. The shadow corridors, the angles that broke line of sight and confused the grid and created pockets of space the collective's architecture couldn't resolve. I thought about Marin, who had handed a man the truth about himself in a system file and paid for it with everything, who had believed the documentation could do what violence couldn't, collapse a program from the inside out by making it visible, undeniable, too large to contain. I thought about Oris at his vendor stall, quick hands and tired eyes, feeding intelligence into an underground he believed in without knowing where it ended. I thought about Vesa, who had said he's not good at this with the affectionate exasperation of someone who had watched from a distance long enough to see what he couldn't see about himself. I thought about 4,000 people inside the collective's walls who were going to wake up to a world that had changed and would spend the next months learning why. Beside me, Kael walked with the same efficient, ground-eating stride, but he had adjusted it again, that barely perceptible calibration, pace set for 2. And this time I didn't pretend I hadn't noticed. When this is finished, I said, when the program is fully exposed and the cells have moved and the collective has been forced to respond, what do you want? He considered the question with the same seriousness he applied to tactical assessments. I want the 14 inside to get out safely, he said. That's operational. I mean after. A longer pause. I've been inside something my entire life, he said. The program, the collective, the performance of it, the containment of it. His voice was even, but the words were carrying their weight honestly. I want outside. I want to exist in a space I chose rather than one I was assigned to. I looked at the broken ground ahead of us, the scrub pushing up through the old substrate, the far-off clean line of the horizon that the wall didn't interrupt out here. That's a reasonable thing to want, I said. What do you want? He asked. I thought about the Central Registry, the ration cards and the suppression schedule and the 10-day transfers and the 3 years of being perfectly, carefully, exhaustingly invisible. I thought about what I had been working toward all that time. Not the resistance's objectives, not the program's exposure, but underneath all of it, the thing that had kept me going when careful and invisible felt like slow erasure. I want to stop performing, I said. I want to exist as what I actually am instead of what's useful to have around. Kael was quiet for a moment. You are, he said simply, exactly what you actually are. You have been since the moment I found you. I looked at him. He looked back at me, steady, certain, no calculation behind it. Just that. Just the plain, load-bearing fact of being known. I faced forward, let out a long, slow breath into the cold morning air. Don't think that means I'm going easy on you, I said. I know, he said. And this time the corner of his mouth did what it had been threatening since the relay station. Moved, shifted, became something that was unmistakably, if briefly, a smile. Small and earned and entirely real. I filed it carefully. The dead city fell away behind us. The open terrain stretched ahead, broken and unscheduled and unmanaged. Everything the collective had spent 40 years calling nothing, holding its ground in the gray morning light with the stubborn persistence of things that survive by refusing to be resolved. We walked into it together, not performing, not managing, not circling, just forward.